All right, well, thank you everyone for being here as we continue with our 2021 webinar series hosted by the Ozark chapter of Wild Ones, Native Plants, Natural Landscapes. This webinar is being recorded. Afterwards, the recording will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, and I'll put a link for that in the chat box here in a few minutes. Wild Ones, Native Plants, Natural Landscapes is a nonprofit organization that promotes environmentally sound landscaping practices to preserve biodiversity through the preservation, restoration, and establishment of native plant communities. If you're interested in joining our chapter, you can go to wildones.org and click on the tab that says join. You can also find out more information about our organization. Our chapter website is ozark.wildones.org. If you go there, you can find out all kinds of information about native plants that grow in this area, what might be good for your particular site or location. You can also request a site visit from our site committee. And we'll have somebody come out and spend about an hour out at your place, giving you some consulting advice on what would grow well in your location. You can also find us on Facebook, follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/Ozark Wild Ones, and reach out to us at wildonesozarkchapter@gmail.com. The next two webinars coming up on our series, we have Tuesday, October 12th from 11 a.m. to noon. Laurie Scott with Northwest Arkansas Community College's Outdoor Living Laboratory is going to speak about eco-type seed collection and cleaning. And then on Wednesday, November 10th from 1 to 2 p.m., Joe Ledvina, the botanist for Arkansas Department of Transportation, will be speaking on RDOT's Monarch Habitat Initiative that they're undertaking there. Roslyn Imrie is our speaker today. Roslyn grew up in the wilderness of the Ozarks Mountains, a region she has called home her entire life. Roslyn graduated from Goddard College in 2011 with a degree in Ozark Ecology and creative writing, and has been an environmental educator for over 10 years. When not teaching, Roslyn enjoys gardening on a little farm outside of Fayetteville with her husband, 2 sons, and a variety of domestic farm and wild species. Today, Roslyn's going to be presenting on putting your native plant garden to bed for winter. I'd like to invite you to stick around after Roslyn's webinar. We will have a brief meeting where we'll be seeking feedback from members and non-members alike on what you would like to see come from our chapter, followed by an open discussion where we want to hear from you about what you're doing to prepare your native plant garden for winter. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Roslyn. Thank you, Roslyn, for being here today.
Thanks, Eric. Hello, everybody. I am excited to be here. I'm also a little nervous. There's a lot of folks in this room that I know a lot about the subject. So I'm still learning. Hopefully we're all still learning, and hopefully we can, learn together. So let's get started. So as we're putting our native garden to bed, hopefully we're all on the same page as far as our garden being an ecosystem. Hopefully we're all gardening with an ecological mindset and thinking of our garden as a habitat. As native plant gardeners, we hopefully are all aware of the importance of native plants and the importance of the native insects that those native plants provide a habitat for. Without native plants and native insects, our ecosystem is in peril. So hopefully we're all on the same page there. I don't want to go on and on about it because I do think this is a room full of people that understand this. So what kind of gardens are we going to kind of be thinking about today? We're thinking about our butterfly gardens and our pollinator gardens. Also, if you're gardening for the birds, then those are the types of gardens we're thinking about. A lot of you might have rain gardens that are full of native plants. Some of this could apply to that as well. But we're also talking about your wooded yards, just the surrounding area. Your native garden doesn't necessarily stop at the little rock barrier that you provide for it. It's bigger than that. So this is going to take into account your greater yard as well. The key to all of this is your native plants is your native insects. So we are going to talk a lot about native insects because they're directly, that's their home are these native plants, and there's a symbiotic relationship between your native insects and the native plants that you're growing in your garden. So throughout the growing season, we all provide food and water for the native creatures in our area through these native gardens. By growing the native plants, we're providing food. Hopefully you have some sort of water source already. And so the missing piece of it is shelter, and shelter is easy to provide during the summer when the flowers are blooming and there's leaves and everything looks lush and gorgeous. It's a little bit harder once we get into winter and things start turning brown and we start kind of judging what do we want to look at and what do we not want to look at. And so a lot of what we're going to talk about today is the shelter that the native garden provides and how to put your garden to bed in a way that provides a healthy habitat and winter shelter for your native species. This is not a cosmetic class. We're not going to talk about how to make your native garden look really pretty. I will touch on that, but hopefully you understand your native garden isn't for just your own enjoyment, but is a shelter, is a home to your native species. So you understand some mess is going to be necessary. So in the winter, the creatures do not disappear. I often work a lot with students talking about butterflies at the botanical garden. And it's interesting, oftentimes when it comes up, where do the butterflies go? Everyone just says, oh, they fly to Mexico. Well, only the monarch flies to Mexico. The rest of them are here. And they aren't in their butterfly stage typically, and they're in a less visible stage of life, but all those insects that we provide an ecosystem for in our native garden throughout the year are still here. A lot of them are in their pupa or egg stage, waiting for spring to either complete their metamorphosis into their adult stage or hatch. So above, we have a couple pictures here. Above, we have a Luna moth cocoon that is completely wrapped in leaves. A lot of these pictures are not my photos, and I've tried to note when they're not. But this is just a great example. You could be looking for this and not see it. It's so well camouflaged, but that's where your Luna moths are in the leaves, oftentimes completely disguised by the leaves. And so if you rake up all the leaves and throw them in the trash can, you're throwing your Luna moths away. Fireflies are another one where I've just seen such a decline in my own lifetime of fireflies. There used to be so many, and I'm seeing so less. And a lot of that is the leaves. There's other contributors for sure. But when we don't provide them a wintering habitat, then they can't survive. So it's very important. So some of them also are in their larval stage, and some of them are in their adult stages, but we do see a lot wintering over as a pupa or egg. So yeah, there's a lot in the garden. So where are they? So they all are in different locations, but there's three main spaces that they're occupying through the winter. And this fits right into the three main parts of the native garden. And so then we're gonna talk about each of these. So we're gonna talk about our native leaves, the leaves that are in your yard, that is part of your native garden. And we're gonna talk about what to do with those to maintain a good and healthy habitat for your native creatures. Then we're going to talk about stems. The stems is probably the most complicated part. That'll be the longest part of this presentation. We'll talk about what to do with the stems and for good nesting material and wintering material. And then we'll talk a little bit about the ground, the creatures that are trying to use the ground, as well as some other considerations to think about as we're preparing for winter. And what a day to start preparing for winter. I feel like this is the first day where I really feel fall in the air today. All right, so we'll start with leaves. Leave the leaves. I'm sure it's something you've heard, and we're gonna dive into these leaves. So 95% of the moths winter over in their pupa stage in the leaves. So we talked about the Luna moth. The woolly bear is another fabulous one. It actually winters over as a caterpillar, cute little fuzzy caterpillar. And it just rolls up and hides in those leaves as a caterpillar. The red hair streak actually lays their eggs in fall on oak leaves, and those little eggs hatch out in spring and eat the oak. That is their host plant, is the oak. And so that's going to be impossible to see. Those little eggs are invisible to someone raking leaves in the yard. That's where those are. And I included this swallowtail chrysalis, even though they usually are on sticks, and this one looks like it's on the bark of a tree. It's so well camouflaged. You wouldn't see it if it had fallen into the leaves. There's a really wide variety of species in the leaves. Leaves also provide nesting and habitat for various reptiles. Your toads and your frogs are under the leaves, as well as a lot of different mammals need those leaves. And then anything that's eating insects needs the leaves so that it has insects to eat. So leaves are vitally important. So the number one thing is, if you can leave it, that would be great. Leaving the leaves where they lie is the most natural thing to do and going to provide the most natural habitat. Using leaves as mulch is a very close runner-up, especially if you already have a native garden and you need to mulch. Mulching in the winter is really beneficial for your native garden. So using leaves as mulch can provide really important moisture to your native garden. It'll keep your soil more healthy. Your soil is alive and full of all sorts of species and nematodes and bacterias and fungi. And by keeping it healthy and covered throughout the winter is going to keep a healthier ecosystem among the soil so that it's ready for spring. There is also some really amazing micronutrients that are in tree leaves in particular. If you think about it, it makes sense. You have these huge trees with super deep roots, and those roots are going down and picking up micronutrients from deep, deep in the earth and pushing it up into the leaves. And then you're able to then use those leaves, putting it back into your soil. I saw some amazing studies about leaf mulch composting versus food, kitchen food composting, and in all regards, just about leaves really were the best for particularly the types of nutrients that a native garden needs. So it's a great way to deal with a lot of those leaves. And of course, then you're creating your habitat right there by your native plants. So your beneficial insects will hopefully be right there in spring, ready to go. They don't have far to travel to be near your native plants. So you're creating the habitat right where you want it. So you might have a lot of leaves. You might be going, I can't put all my leaves into my mulch. I can't leave them all in my yard. I need some other ideas. So a little bit less ideal solutions for some of those leaves is a leaf only composting is a fine way. If you just have leaves, a lot of those creatures are going to be fine throughout the winter in a big pile of leaves. If you need to give some away, that's a solution. If maybe you have a neighbor that has a native garden and doesn't have as many trees and could use some of that leaf mulch. If you do give it away, please use paper bags, not those big black plastic bags. If you put all these leaves in a big black plastic bag and leave it out in the sun, you're very likely to just bake everything in there and kill all of those guys that you're wanting to keep alive. So A paper bag is a much better transportation, or, there's various other things, but just don't use like a black plastic bag. And then putting them in your kitchen compost pile is like bottom of the list. Your kitchen compost is going to get hot. It's not an ideal space for a lot of these little eggs and little larvas that are among the leaves. And so not very many of them are going to survive, but I would say more of them will survive than if you haul it off to the dump, put it in the landfill. It's better than those solutions, which I'm not even including those. So a couple other ideas. I've made a cage like this for certain species. Now this isn't great for something like a fruit tree because it can create fungus along the bark, and you'll have issues there. But for certain species, this could be a good way to help winter them over, especially as we're seeing unpredictable winters, like the winter we just had, where when those really cold days started, we thought, well, it'll kill off non-native species, but we shouldn't see native species go. But we actually did see some native species not be able to handle that really, really horrible cold snap. So providing a little extra protection, it's a great way to utilize those leaves and protect your native plants. Hopefully we won't see a lot of those super cold days, but with climate change, it's really hard to predict. But I've had great luck with helping native species and non-native, to be honest, get through a winter by protecting them with this little like cage of leaves. Provides a little insulation. If you are leaving the leaves, some other things to think about is if you mow your leaves really, if you mow your lawn and there's leaves there and you mow it really short, really low to the ground, you might be just chopping up those insects. Same kind of thing if you're, throwing it in some kind of chopper to make leaf mulch, you're going to chop up the little guys that are hiding out in there. So maybe if you have real thick leaves, leaving just a thin layer that you can get over with a mower and mow a little bit taller, that would be helpful. Those leaves will help your lawn. If it's super thick, sure, that could kill off your grass, but a thin layer of leaves is not going to kill off the grass and is going to actually be beneficial for grass if you have a grassy lawn. And then leaving this all till late spring is ideal. You want as many of those insects to emerge in spring as possible. I included this great photo here. This is a slug moth caterpillar that I found while playing in leaves in fall with my children. This little guy has the most amazing way of crawling. It's like he's got little ripples and kind of moves along like a slug. But here, this is a good example of one of the little creatures that's living amongst your leaves. Next, we'll talk about all the stems, all the plant stems that are in your native garden, particularly those wildflowers that you've been growing all year. So stems are a great place for cavity nesting creatures, and 30% of solitary bees nest over in stems. They're cavity nesters. So that means they are gonna, you can see in this picture here, this little bee butt, they burrow into pithy centers and lay their eggs. Those eggs then hatch into larvae, pupate, and they emerge as bees. So providing them this important nesting material is absolutely crucial to solitary bee populations. You might know this, but solitary bees do the work of 100 honeybees. They are much more efficient at pollinating. A lot of them come out in more ideal parts of the year. There's a whole lot of, there's hundreds of species. So they're coming out throughout the year. They're doing a better job at pollinating. And there are even studies that say, you know, the presence of so many honeybees is not helping our native solitary bees. And it might actually be not beneficial for us to have so many honeybees. And so the native solitary bees are super important for our ecosystem. And it's also good to note that solitary bees live by themselves. They do not have a hive, so they don't have the ability, they don't sting, they're going to leave you alone. They're beneficial in every way. And so they winter over in the stems. So here's a list of some different bees that we're talking about. These tunnel into trees and logs, and a lot of them really like hollow stems. And so your native garden is full of hollow stems right now, or stems that are pithy in the middle, and are going to be a great habitat for these little guys. So different sized bees need different sized holes. This diagram here I borrowed from an insect hotel class that I taught. So obviously you don't need to go out there with a tape measure and measure the widths. If you are creating an insect hotel, you know, you might pick different drill bits, but if you're just thinking native garden, you don't need to measure these things. But I do think it's interesting to look at how variously different, what a different variety of holes different bees need for their nesting sites. So some need a very small hole, others need a much larger hole because they're different sizes. And a lot of them really like those pithy centers, pithy wood, which what do I mean by that? This is a photo I took for y'all. It is actually of a plant called a cup plant, which I'll go over here in a minute. But you can see how the middle of this is almost like, it's like spongy, it's super soft. I can press on it with my thumb here and just kind of pokes right through it. That's the ideal material for these cavity nesting bees. They can just easily burrow into these stems. They also almost always have a small hole already there. So they kind of have an ability for those bees to get in there and burrow out what they need and use it as a nesting site. So for your tiny bees, like your little yellow-faced bees and aphid hunting wasps, you're going to need smaller stems, right? So these are just some examples. This is not by any means a full list. I just wanted to give you all some ideas of some of the spaces that you might be looking for these guys. So bee balm is a great space for cavity nesting bees, the smallest ones. That's also wild bergamot. Want to make sure you find your native variety of that. There are a lot of varieties of bee balm. Elderberry is a wonderful one. It's a great plant all the way around. Beautiful flowers, lovely berries. And then a lot of different perennial flowers have a pithy center. Cone flowers is a great example of this. All your cone flowers have a perfect center for bees. For some larger bees, you want larger plants. So two that I wanted to touch on, one is a native thistle. And I know as soon as you say thistle, any farmer goes, oh my gosh, I don't want thistle. We're not talking the invasive thistle. The invasive thistle that plagues us all has big, broad leaves, giant spikes. These native thistles are not nearly as spiky, though they have spikes. They're not like piercing, they're just a little pokey. And it's a much more reasonable plant. Obviously, you don't want to plant this near your walkway, but if you have a large amount of space, a native thistle is a great habitat for these wintering creatures, and it also is a wonderful pollinator. Cup plant, that was the pithy center I showed you earlier, hosts hundreds of wintering insects. It is a fabulous plant. It grows very tall. Mine is about 8 feet. So definitely something you got to provide some space for. Mine's about 8 feet tall and takes up a good 2-3 foot circle area. It gets its name from these little cups that its leaves provide, and that's a great source for water throughout the year. And then its stem is large and hollow in the very middle, pithy and square, which is just fascinating to me. So few things are perfect squares in the natural world. So these square stems are what's key to providing a good habitat for those nesting bees. A couple more, there's a lot of bees that really like the native dewberry and sawtooth blackberries, those native berries that we have around here. And large carpenter bees, those ones that are trying to burrow into your porch, will burrow into yucca stem. I think they might also like a cup plant. The yucca stem cup plants have nice big centers. We do have a native Arkansas yucca around here that is ideal for them. So what do we do with these stems? We know that they're a good habitat. Let's go through step by step. What do we do with these stems? A lot of these graphics and a lot of this came from the Xerces Society, by the way. So step one, in fall, leave the flowers for the birds. You might at some point say, okay, every last seed has been plucked off of my flowers. At that point, it's probably safe to cut them back, but leave them until, you know, the birds have plucked the seeds from them. Then in spring is when you really should cut them back. If you've let the seed heads go, you're going to cut the dud flower stalks off in spring. It's best to do this actually at varying heights, because by cutting them at varying heights, you're going to get a variety of widths and depths, and it's going to be a better habitat for a wider variety of bees. So I've read cutting between 8 and 24 inches. You can kind of even that out and say, you know, around 18 inches, but, you know, give or take, what you're actually doing is you're simulating deer browsing. And with deer in nature, deer would, you know, cut off the ends of different stems at various lengths. You also want to look for branches and nodes, because those will, when the branch comes in, or a node, oftentimes in a plant, that'll create a kind of a wall inside that hollow or pithy stem. And so you want to provide at least 4 to 6 inches from that branch or node. That way there's still space before the bee hits something a little more solid. The tops, once you cut off these tops, what do you do with them? Well, you can mulch with them, compost them. You can bundle them together for additional nesting sites, or maybe create a little dry arrangement. So those are some ideas. As spring emerges, look for blocked stems. That would be the nest. So over here we have a picture of a stem that's blocked by a leaf. This would be a leaf cutter bee that's blocked this opening. Some of them will block it with mud or even like a resin. So look for that, and that might then allow you to think, okay, this is a plant that my bees really like, or this is a height that my bees really like. Hopefully you can improve this year after year for the specific species that are in your yard. We all have different species in our yard, so we can't, it's not an exact science. It kind of depends on who you have living there, what they're going to do. So then in summer, your new growth will come up and it'll hide those stems. You might notice we have not taken those bottom parts of those stems out of our garden yet. And that is because they are full of the larvae. It takes like 11 months for these guys to go through all the stages, go through their complete metamorphosis and come out as adults. So to do this, you know, really ideally, we're going to leave those stems through the summer, let our beautiful garden flourish around them, and then fall comes again. And again, we want to leave our flower heads, or at least leave them until the birds have plucked them. And then in spring, we've gone a whole year now. That is when your new adults are going to pupate and emerge in spring. And then if you've done this right and you've cut your native garden again at varying heights, there is their nesting grounds right there waiting for them. They can emerge out of the year-old stems and nest in the newly cut stems and create another generation. And so as you do this year after year, hopefully you can see an increase of your solitary bees and create a little relationship with these guys. So at that point, you can let those decompose there in your garden, or you can remove them. Once they have had a whole year to pupate and emerge as adults, that would be when you finally are removing those stems. Stems can make, flower heads can make beautiful arrangements too. Not all of these are native. In this picture here to the right, this is not a native arrangement necessarily, but it's still very beautiful and a great idea, a great way to keep the seed heads in your yard without just letting them fall over right there. Pardon me. Next, we're going to talk about the ground. So we've talked about what are we doing with the native leaves? What have we done with the native stems? And finally, we're going to talk about the ground in our native garden. So 70% of bees are ground nesters. So if you can do a little math, we have 30% in the stems, 70% of the bees are nesting the grounds. Yeah, bees don't make nice little hives somewhere. They're there in your native garden trying to find their place to be. And I know I've talked a lot about bees, but they're just a good, they're a good poster child, but all of these things are helping a wide variety of your native critters. So the ground nesting bees, they need loose, bare soil. Ideally a little more sandy than a lot of what we have here in the Ozarks. They're not going to burrow into clay very well. So I read that they like south-facing slopes. I have them in my yard and they're just, it's not sloped anyway. So I don't know if there's a lot to that. They might prefer that. They might be fine. But this does need to be a space that's undisturbed, because just like those cavity nesting bees, these guys are going to take 11 months between the time when the adult bee goes into that hole and lays the egg to when the adult emerges, hatches from the egg, goes through its larva, pupates, and emerges as an adult bee. So this is a longer commitment. So you want to find a space of ground that isn't being walked on by people. It can continue to be loose, bare, sandy soil. I took these pictures here in my yard of some bees nesting under my cedar trees. So this is not far from my yard, and you can see it's not a large area of space. It's not like you don't need to go clearing space for a little patch of bare soil. They just need a small patch. So here's kind of a list of some of the bees we're talking about. There's more than that are on this list. This was just kind of a short list. I'm saying the word bees a lot. Some of these are technically in the wasp family as well, but they're all wonderful pollinators and beneficial insects. We are not talking about ground nesting wasps. So there are wasps that are aggressive and live in like a colony in the ground. That is not what we're talking about here. And you probably don't want those guys in the yard. They can be very aggressive and they do sting. They're territorial for sure. So here's kind of two pictures. The top one is a mining bee. And that's just one example of one of the many ground nesting bees. But you can see it's nice and furry. Some of them end up looking a little bit more like flies, I feel like, but the wasps look, significantly shiny and have the black and red markings. So do look out for ground nesting wasps. But the bees, you're going to have one bee per nest. They're going to merge in the super earliest part of spring. And these guys are crucial for those early pollination and the pollination of fruit trees. So some ideas, how are we going to create a little patch of ground in our native garden? One great way is bunch grass or grass that's going to form little clumps, because between those clumps, you're going to have little spaces of covered, undisturbed, bare ground, especially if you kind of add a little sand around there, maybe some little gravelly, coarse sand, little rocks, something like that. You're going to have spaces in between the grasses. So grasses also provide a great habitat for a really wide variety of other insects. They also provide habitat for our reptiles and mammals. Of course, this is a grass we're not thinking, we're landscaping with this grass. We're using this grass as a garden plant. We're not talking, we're going to just mow this grass, because that would defeat the purpose of having it as a winter habitat. So here's some examples. Side oats grama and pink muley grass are two great clumping grasses. Some more switch grass. Little bluestem is a favorite. Little bluestem is a host of 19 different butterflies. It's really great protection for a wide variety of beneficial insects. If you want to learn more about different plant selections, we have a fabulous list on our website at bgozarks.org under native plant information. There's a wonderful list created by Alyssa Morrison, and that's where I stole some of these particular ones was from that list. So there's a much larger list too. You can get some more ideas. Also, another space you'll want to think about are all the little cracks between pavers. If you have little pathways, something like that, then you might have little spaces for some sand, for some gravel, and for these little guys to be nesting in. So be thinking about those spaces, maybe preparing those spaces a little bit, bringing in maybe a thin layer of pebbles or sand to add to that, so that these little guys have a good place to nest in the winter. So some of you are probably thinking, there's no way I'm going to do this. I can't just leave my garden a mess. Well, I do understand that. We do work at the botanical garden, and we cannot leave our garden a mess. So we've gone through kind of what is ideal, but let's talk a little bit about what can some of us do if what we've talked about so far is not ideal. Some of us might have, yards that are in subdivisions. There's also an argument that, if we're trying to promote native plants, if it's too messy and just really looks outrageous, then people are going to say, well, I don't want native plants in my yard. That's too much. So there's a balance here. So if you want to cut back earlier, cutting back in fall, that's definitely going to make your garden look a lot more maintained and manicured if you cut back in fall. There's various other ways to feed the birds. Making dried arrangements could possibly leave a lot for the birds. I, for one, don't see a single seed left on my echinacea. My birds have taken all of that. So you might find a lot of those seed heads have just been spent. The birds have already taken everything they need from that, and there isn't a lot left. So take a look at that and consider cutting back in fall if you want to keep your native garden looking a little more maintained and cut. Again, don't cut super low to the ground. Varying heights is helpful, But if you really just want a more manicured look, hitting about 18 inches is kind of a good medium, right? So the varying heights does seem to help the diverse bee population. But if you want to just have a nice flat look, like these stems up here in the top right corner, then an 18 inches is a good spot to aim for. You're going to have plenty of success with that. And then keep as much of those stems and leaves and yard waste as possible. Here's a nice way where someone has made a little bump, right? It doesn't look super messy. It's not all over the yard. It's kind of in one nice little area. And they've layered this. They've put down, layers of their stems, then layers of their leaves, and kind of layered it on top of itself, and created a space that is for all of these, all of their native plants. So that's another good way to get it out of your sight a little more. As you clean up, you might consider building some insect hotels. Insect hotels can be made really beautiful. You can add different things that maybe aren't from your native garden. You can get out and get some river cane or add some bamboo if you have something like that. You can drill holes into different logs. That'll be helpful as well. Again, you want to think about varieties of spaces, varieties of holes, and spaces for the different species. One thing that's super important to think about if you're going insect hotel direction is they definitely need to be cleaned. They can look a little more messy. They don't have to be, it's up to you. You can make them look real pretty. You can make them look messy, but it is super important that they're cleaned every year. The reason why a lot of folks have moved away from encouraging insect hotels and just encouraging thinking about how to put your native garden to bed in a more ecological fashion is because these insect hotels can breed disease. And then you're, again, doing exactly the opposite of what you want to do by having a disease-infested little hotel that they're all getting sick from. So make sure if you do end up adding an insect hotel because you are cleaning up your yard a little bit more, hauling a bit more of that native materials off, that you're cleaning it every year. Adding a simple log, planting a log in your yard, or leaving a log there is also a way to encourage some more of these creatures to thrive, even if you clean up a bit. And a brush pile is a great way to give all sorts of creatures a space to winter over, getting into birds. So yeah, don't haul everything too far away. All right, and then we're going to go over just a few other things to consider while you're putting your garden to bed. Your soil, again, it really is going to be better off in the spring if you mulch as much as possible. And again, those leaves are the most ecological way to mulch, because then you're keeping all your native creatures here in your native garden. One way to work with the leaves too that I really would recommend is adding a bit of straw on top of the leaves. Here in the Ozark, we have really windy winters, and your leaves might just all blow around and end up in your neighbor's yard. So if you add a bit of straw on top, sometimes that straw can kind of hold those leaves down. It's not going to destroy the habitat. It's only going to add to the mulching benefit, and you'll have a lot less blowing around. You don't want to add hay. Hay has way more seeds in it than straw does. So if you are looking to getting something to put on top of the leaves, no hay, yes to straw. You might try using some pebbles or light wood chips, again, for a variety of different spaces. Using wood chips on your pathways, but leaves on your bed is a really great way to go, because then again, you have multiple different kind of little micro ecosystems, and the wood chips work well on pathways. Landscaping fabric does not do much good for all of your native creatures, so I would say avoid using that. And a lot of those heavy wood chips that are dyed and treated are not good for your native habitats. So going more natural with that is best. Here in the Ozarks, we really don't need a lot of water in our native garden in the winter. So I pack everything up. You don't want busted hoses. So now's the time to start thinking about that. We still got a ways off till our first freeze, but probably want to start collecting your watering systems. Usually the irrigation can stay under the mulch, but then, you know, last year was a crazy year. We had some really deep cold temperatures. So I think we all have to just reevaluate everything we think is true and try it year by year. You might want to leave a hose handy for dry times, or if you do plant native seeds in the fall, you want to leave something handy, or use a watering can. Also, hopefully you're already thinking about it, but hopefully you can provide some way of giving water to all of your wildlife in your native garden throughout the winter, because that is a super important time to provide some water. It's a good time to clean your tools, clean and sanitize things. You can kind of breed diseases. This isn't as important with native gardens as it is with like a vegetable garden or fruit trees or things like that, because there just are less things that are diseasing a healthy native garden. It's something to consider. You might have some of your things in pots. You might be growing perennials in pots or annual native plants in pots. So your perennial pots are usually fine, but you do want to think, you know, in this really, when it gets really cold, if the pot is up above the ground, the cold can really seep in and you can end up killing those roots. So you either want to protect it a little bit more through the winter, or, you know, transplant it before winter, because even a good hardy native plant can end up dying in a pot in a real hard cold snap, because it doesn't have the warmth of the soil protecting it, and probably doesn't have a lot of mulch on it and whatnot. So that's something to think about as we enter winter. Your annual pots, obviously they're, you know, you might have seeded some new things in there, but your annual pots can be dumped out. Maybe you have a way that you recycle your soil. A lot of people have asked, you know, can you reuse soil from pots? With native plants, a lot of times you can, because you don't have a lot of those diseases. But if you ever do have a plant that's died off, you probably don't want to use that soil from that pot, because there could be, you know, something in there, some little larva maybe that's eating the roots of your plant, some kind of, you know, fungus that's getting into the plant. So if you have an unhealthy plant, you definitely want to work on sanitizing that soil before using it again. You don't want to just plant something new, let it sit and plant something new in the next year. So this is also a time to trim up any trees that you want to trim. I mean, obviously native trees don't need a lot of pruning, but it might be that there's a branch in the way. Most of them, you know, winter is a good time to think about pruning. This isn't a pruning class, but I thought I'd mention that. It's a good time to cut any dead wood back. You just have less reason for insects or fungi to get into your wood. So winter is a good time for cutting anything back like that. You'll want to mulch the base of delicate trees. Most native plants don't need, you know, most native trees don't need a lot, but not a bad idea. Add some nutrients to the soil. With that case, wood chips sometimes are better because you don't want a lot of leaves, up against the bark of a tree. Oftentimes that can create fungus and problems. This is also a time to think about this coming spring. You might want to test your soil. You might want to think about what are you planting for next year. A lot of native seeds need to be cold stratified. That means they need to feel the winter and then feel it warm for spring. And it's a more scientific process than that, but basically a lot of seeds are planted in fall. Milkweed, we have a picture of milkweed here. Milkweed is a plant that needs cold stratification. So planting it in fall, and this is a great time to think about planting some of those things. It's got to still be planted when it's freezing at night. So as we get through winter and start approaching spring, the question comes up, is it too late to plant these native seeds that need to be cold stratified? As long as we're still seeing freezes at night, it should be fine. If you plant it earlier in the fall, like if you really plant it in fall, not in winter, you do want to think about the birds because they might dig up your seeds. So somehow protect them, maybe under mulch, so that they have a fighting chance and don't just get eaten by the birds. Here's kind of a list of a lot of my pictures and resources. The Xerces Society was a great resource for this. If you want to do more reading there, I would recommend it. Also, again, we have a native plant list on our BG Ozarks website. And as Eric said, the Ozark Wild Ones website has a wealth of information, a wealth of lists as well. So those are all great places to dig into the specifics of this more. And I think that's about all I have. I'm happy to try to answer questions best I can. Oh, Eric, you're muted.
All right, how's that?
There we can hear you.
Still getting used to the Zoom age. All right, but thank you, Roslyn. That was a great presentation, a lot of great information. It looks like we have some great feedback already in the chat box. I want to encourage everyone to enter your questions into the chat box, and I'll read them to Roslyn here in a few minutes. Just a quick reminder that after the webinar is over, we're going to have a brief feedback meeting from members and non-members on just to make some announcements and to request some ideas from people or suggestions on what you would like to see come from our chapter. And then following that, we'll just have an open discussion where we'll let people turn on their microphones and videos if they want to take part. And just we'd like to hear from you on what you're doing to prepare your native plant garden for winter. Just have a talk and chat. That should start at about 12:30, we're thinking. But for right now, let's see. I'll read this from Izzy. Izzy is looking at ideas for conserving pollinator nesting materials in a working trial garden where they do have to cut things down in the fall to avoid being inundated with volunteers in the spring. But they're toying with the idea of piling canes and debris into quote unquote wild corners that can easily be cleaned up in late spring if need be. I guess that's more of a comment. But then Kayla says, regarding the Leave the Leaves campaign, while they do love to do that, their neighborhood has regulations regarding leaf removal. What would you recommend to someone like them who is bound by civic regulation to remove leaves? Because if there's a way around that, they would like to know.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, if you really can't leave them there, then pull them aside in some form or fashion. Like I had said, a leaf only pile. If you don't want them blowing around, you can get a piece of fencing from any kind of farm store and kind of make a circle of fencing and then put all your leaves in there. That's going to look better. People are just going to think, oh, it's a little composting pile. Hopefully that's allowed in your neighborhood, and that's definitely better than hauling them off somewhere else. Or like I had said, maybe give them away to someone else. I'd give a couple different ways to deal with that, I think.
All right. James asks, as for sanitizing bee hotels, at what time are they unoccupied?
Yeah, so with the bee hotels, similar to the cutting back type of thing. So you're going to build your bee hotel in really early spring or late winter. Those bees are going to nest in there. Then that larva needs all the way till the next spring to emerge. So you are going to wait a full year, wait for the new bees to emerge in late spring, and then get rid of it. Sanitize anything, you know, if you have a structure, you want to sanitize that structure. You don't want to reuse the same, you know, the same sticks and whatnot. You want to get rid of it, start fresh each year, but you do want to wait a full year so that those that whole generation can emerge in spring.
Karen asks, is it okay to leaf mulch a rain garden?
I'm not a rain garden expert. I would think that that would not be as ideal because, you know, the leaves do a really great job of not letting water go places. And so you might clog something up. It probably wouldn't be a good idea to mulch a rain garden.
Jim asks, is he doing any damage to insect population when he eliminates invasive privets? He's cutting close to the base and painting around on the stump. Loves to leave the leaves idea and lives outside of town where it's no problem.
That was privet particularly?
Yes.
Yeah, so privet is a non-native species. There are no, to my knowledge, there's no native creature that needs it or even uses it. There are non-native. There's this beautiful sphinx moth. That's a privet sphinx moth. It is not native to the area. And sure, it enjoys it, but just as the privet's not native, it's not native. So there is plenty of privet out there. So please get rid of the privet. There's no lack of privet. I have no use for privet. So yeah, get rid of it.
Like the winter time, you really notice it because it tends to stay green, and you see it all on the edges, fence lines, that sort of stuff.
That and the honeysuckle, the Japanese honeysuckle,
right?
Just taking over Northwest Arkansas.
Yep. Kayla asks, if using leaves as mulch in the fall, should they leave the leaf mulch as is in the spring and summer, or should they be turned under or into the soil at some point?
Yeah, definitely leave it in spring. So spring is when these insects are emerging, either out of their pupa stage into adulthood or hatching from their eggs. So you want to leave it as long as possible until as many of those creatures have emerged. Once you get into maybe late summer or early fall, then just about everything is, you know, emerged. And that would be a good time to then start turning it in, and before you get the new leaves falling down. So, so really this would be a good time to probably think there's probably not a lot in your leaves right now. It's once those new leaves that are on the trees right now fall, then you're going to start having new creatures in there. So now's a good time to turn old leaves into your soil.
I don't know, you have to leave it here in a few minutes, so we'll limit it to just two more questions if you have time.
Yeah, I'm okay a little bit longer.
Okay. Pam asked, if they have a large non-native tree, is it better to leave those leaves or to remove them?
I guess it kind of depends on what tree. There are some trees that really do more damage than good. And then there's some that aren't hurting much. So I think it kind of depends on the tree. An example, we have a tree of heaven in our yard when we bought our house, and we ended up getting rid of that tree because it just takes over. It's taking over the whole ecosystem. It sends out these little guys, and so it's just bad news. But there's other trees that, yeah, they're not native, but they're trees, they're doing fine. So I think it just depends on what tree you have. Maybe do a little research into the tree. Is it invasive or is it just a non-native tree?
Okay, and then another person whose Zoom name is just iPhone is too much tree canopy bad for leaves left under them on the ground for insect use?
Yeah, like can there be too much leaves? I don't think the insects are going to be harmed by too much leaves, but if you're trying to grow things, if you have native plants under there, if you have any type of grass you're wanting to have under there, too much leaves will kind of stop any other growth, particularly certain species of leaves. There are certain species of leaves that really make the soil acidic. So it's more of a thought of what are you trying to grow there? Are you trying to have a native garden there? And if so, yes, there is such thing as too many leaves. Is it just a natural wooded space for insects and for habitat? If that's the case, it's just a natural space for habitat. I really don't think there's a too much leaves. You'll only have life cycles reproducing in the top layer, but that bottom layer will start decomposing and having all sorts of fungi and turning into soil. So there's no negative impact on the insects, just on the plants that you're trying to grow.
All right. Well, thank you, Roslyn. That was a lot of great information. We really appreciate you taking the time to put the presentation together and to share your expertise with us. That was a lot of great information, and it looks like there's a lot of great feedback in the chat. I wish I had time to read all the comments, but I'll send them to you through email so you can see all of the great things people have been saying. Yeah, again, I want to thank everyone else for being here today. The recording of this webinar will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. I put the link for that in the chat box, and I can send it out here in a little bit too to anyone who may not be able to find it in the chat. But if you go to YouTube, type in Wild Ones Ozark Chapter, you'll be able to see a recording of all of our past webinars. The next webinar will be Tuesday, October 12th from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. And that will be Laurie Scott with Northwest Arkansas Community College's Outdoor Living Laboratory. She'll be talking about ecotype seed collection and cleaning. So why ecotypes are important and how do we prepare those seeds for germination. Again, if you want to join Wild Ones, go to wildones.org/join. Check us out on our chapter website at ozark.wildones.org or on Facebook at facebook.com/ozarkwildones. You can also reach out to us via email at wildonesozarkchapter@gmail.com. With that, I'm going to conclude the webinar and stop recording here, and we'll give Roslyn a chance to go about, and then we'll start our virtual meeting.
Before I go, I do want to say I welcome you all to come check out our BG Ozarks website. We do have a fall class series there as well. Our first one actually starts tonight. It's a straw bale building class about how to build a house with straw bales. And then we'll also talk about gardening with straw bales. So if that's of any interest to you, get over there. There's only a couple more hours to sign up for that. And then we have classes all the way through spring. So the fall lineup is there until Christmas. We have make and take classes in the garden, and then a lot of virtual classes. Most of our classes are virtual, but we have a few that are in person this year. And then next spring, we'll have more classes as well. So as learners of these topics, come on over and see what we've got going on at the Botanical Garden of the Ozarks as well. So thanks for having me today, and have a wonderful day, and happy gardening, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Roslyn. Yeah, I encourage everyone to go to the Botanical Garden of the Ozarks.